today. I hope you can hear this okay on an iPhone, but I'm going to play.
I can jack it into the.
Can you?
Yeah.
Okay. iPhone adapter.
Is the mic on?
This one only has the lightning port, is that right? Or, yeah, this one only has the lightning port. So maybe
But is the microphone on? Does it pick up
do you need
that?
the mic?
Well, I'm just saying.
We might need the mic.
Yeah, I'll put it up to the mic. But this is a piece that Allen Ginsberg wrote. So I'm sort of introducing you to my main subject, Kerouac, through his friends. But this one is particularly meaningful to me. It's called Father Death Blues. And I kind of discussed this the last time I was here, but I kind of had to struggle for my own life this year. I had some serious health issues and major surgeries, you know, just as we got to know our daughter. So this is very meaningful to me.
Father Death, I'm flying home. Hey, old man, you're all alone. Hey, old daddy, I know where I'm going. Father Death, don't cry anymore. Mama's there underneath the floor. Brother Death, please mind the score. Old Auntie Death, I hear your groans, old Uncle Death. I see your bones, oh Sister Death, how sweet your moans. Oh children deaths, go breathe your breaths, sobbing breaths, so ease your deaths. Pain is gone, tears take the rest. Genius death, your art is done. Lover death, your body's gone. Father death, I'm coming home. Guru death, your words are true. Teacher death, I do thank you for inspiring me to sing this blues. Buddha death, I wake with you. Dharma death, your mind is new. Sangha death will work it through. Suffering is what was born. Ignorance made me forlorn. Tearful truths I cannot scorn. Father breath, once more farewell. Birth you gave was no thing ill. My heart is still as time will tell.
So like I said, that gave me a great deal of comfort as I dealt with that this year. Each time that I went into surgery, I gave that a listen first. I play that for you because Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac were two of the best known beats as we know them now. It was an artistic movement, a literary movement. But what isn't often recognized is it was also a major religious movement for America. Yes, Scott.
Sorry, I just wasn't here with for Joys and Concerns. I just forgot to say a joy. Can I light a candle for it?
Absolutely.
I'm just happy that it's Stella's birthday today. Can you put it out there?
Okay,
That's not really the way to do it.
that's fine.
I think it on this.
So, in fact, I have this, some of the Dharma. It's a little bit of a rarer text by Kerouac. It was collected by the scholars that run his estate after his death. And it was essentially his notes on Buddhism as he began to learn about it. It was kind of originally intended as a series of letters to Allen Ginsberg. In fact, I think maybe because Ginsberg outlived Kerouac, and the Ginsberg that we might have in our mind is an older gentleman, while the Kerouac we have in our mind is this young angel-headed hipster that is probably who Ginsberg was referring to in How. And we'll get a little down the road, we'll talk about why we kind of have that image of Kerouac fixed in our head instead of a 47-year-old man. He actually lived to 47, which isn't a terribly old age, but nonetheless, it's not this young fellow we recognize him as. But in the beginning of this, there is a dedication to Allen Ginsberg. I love Allen Ginsberg. Let that be recorded in heaven's unchangeable heart. You could say that the three main beats actually were Kerouac, Ginsberg, and William S. Burroughs. Of the three of those main beats, Burroughs was generally somewhat negative toward religion. He was rather ecumenical in that and outspoken in it. But Kerouac and Ginsberg very deeply explored religion. Kerouac, and I actually have this recently bought, this was my Christmas gift to me, collection of all of Kerouac's road novels, as they're called. A lot of people aren't aware, but he had a much grander vision than most people recognize. He had several novels, actually, that were written really stemming from a 3-year period where he traveled. But that grew into 6 different novels, of which really most of us probably only are aware of 2. On the Road being the more famous, and Dharma Bums being the little bit less famous. But I would argue that Dharma Bums, in a way, is more important. The reason I say that is because Kerouac doesn't get a lot of credit for it, but he really brought Buddhism to America. A lot of times you have the scholars lay the groundwork for those sorts of paradigm shifts, and often it's the artists that actually translate it to the people. And there was some tension in that. Last time I was here, I talked about a gentleman named Alan Watts, who was a scholar. They didn't get along. In fact, they were both present at the first reading of How, which I mentioned earlier, Ginsberg's seminal poem. And Watts couldn't stand Kerouac from the get-go. It might have had something to do with how jolly he was as he passed a gallon of wine around the audience. Watts didn't take him seriously at all. But I think that was a mistake. If you even flip through this series of notes, some of the Dharma that Kerouac compiled, it's rather extensive. It begins with sort of first principles. Most of you are probably aware of the Four Noble Truths, at least that there are 4 noble truths fundamental to Buddhist practice. And that's, the first one is all life is sorrowful. The second one is the cause of suffering is ignorant craving. Often we think of that generally as desire. The suppression of suffering can be achieved. And the way is the Noble Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path, in a way, could be parallel to the Christian 10 Commandments. It's sort of a general guideline for how to live right. To alleviate suffering is the main goal within Buddhism. I'd argue that that's a common goal within religion, right? We alleviate suffering. The reason that I started out with sort of facing down our mortality, death, right, is because that's what suffering in life ultimately leads to, right? Most religious and spiritual practice is, in essence, when you really boil it down, to alleviate that fear in us, right? Because I would say that most of us, when we're actually facing our mortality, if we have done so, it's scary. Even if you have these sort of comforts and spiritual cushions, it's scary, right? So Kerouac, and what's been interesting about rereading these texts in parallel, because I've basically been going about it, chapter one, with On the Road and Dharma bombs. And I've started to recognize really obvious parallels that he was setting up, and often he's recognized as, in fact, the myth of Kerouac is that he typed out On the Road on a single scroll of paper in like 2 weeks and it was done, right? Not exactly true. He was actually a careful editor and very intentionally made parallels between those two books and other of his writings. One that really stands out to me, in chapter 1 of On the Road, he talks about Ecclesiastes. It's almost like a throwaway comment toward the end of chapter 1, but it's really central to all of his writings and studies. He has a character well known called Dean Moriarty, and that's actually, he often put his friends in his books. That's actually Neil Cassidy, who later drove the Further bus, if you've ever heard of that, with the Merry Pranksters and Ken Casey, which it's interesting because I'm also reading Sometimes a Great Notion, and it just so happens the chapter I was on also mentioned this part of Ecclesiastes, which basically is talking about taking only our portion under the sun, right? All else is described by Ecclesiastes as vanity and vexation, right? So it's very parallel to Buddhist thought, alleviating suffering through reducing desire, right? Ignorant desire. So he draws that parallel even back in his, what I would call his Catholic journey of faith, which is On the Road, which is parallel to his Buddhist journey of faith. But Dean Moriarty is important to the book because he really sets Dean Moriarty up as a foil from the beginning in terms of, he has a lot of bodily hungers and intellectual hungers, but he's really driven by, anytime he's hungry, it's got to be an immediate assuagement to that. So he really draws that out early on about this character. So one thing I want to mention too, often the Beat generation, that literary movement, people make a lot of assumptions about why it's the Beat generation. They're often associated with jazz, which was very crucial to the movement. And it's also very Zen, if you think about it, because the Zen principle is this kind of, as close as you could spiritually get to a sort of flying by the seat of your pants. And in fact, Zazen means just sitting, right? It seems like a rather simple practice. So jazz is much like that with improvisation as well, right? You sort of take life as it comes to you and design a plan. But Beat actually was coined by Kerouac, and it actually stems from his Catholic background, again, because it's short for beatification or beatific, right? Because he saw something very holy in the practice that his friends were seeking, right? They were seeking to shed a lot of the materialism that came from the 40s and 50s that they saw. And so Kerouac, in these endeavors, in these journeys, that was his point, was to narrow life down to basically what he could carry around on his back from place to place. And he did that, like I said, for a few years, travel around. Yes.
I don't know if you want to expand on that just a little bit. I think I remember that part of the Beat movement was pushback from the aftermath of the war and the attitude that people had. It was
Absolutely, yeah. After World War II ended, conformity was the norm, right? And it was, because I think of the war mentality, there was this sort of groupthink in a sense of, everybody sort of pitching in and just doing what is necessary to win the war.
being good soldiers.
Absolutely, yes. And, that's when, a lot of manufacturing really picked up as well. So you had this kind of carbon copy mentality almost, you could say. So yeah, it was absolutely, one of the main purposes was to disturb that, but really at the core of the term for the movement was this sort of religiosity. I mean, a lot of people wouldn't assume that because they are often associated with the sort of pre-hippie movement. Ginsberg was actually very much involved in the later hippie movement. But by Dharma bums, Kerouac is much more overt about saying that he's on a religious quest. And in fact, has sort of posed himself as a religious hero. I mean, he more or less out and says it. But he parallels his motif from Ecclesiastes with the Diamond Sutra from Buddhism. And a phrase particular that he quotes is, "Practice charity without holding in mind any conceptions about charity, for charity is after all just a word." So by now he's grown from these, sort of bodily and intellectual urges that is exemplified in Dean Moriarty, and is very explicit in the fact that he is on a spiritual quest of sorts. He also very early on in Dharma Bums meets a homeless person who carries around this token from and prayer from Saint Teresa. And you find another parallel there that makes you wonder if he had a plan from the beginning, because Saint Teresa's prayers that she'll return, and that she'll return to earth by showering the earth with roses for every creature that ever lived. And then in the Dharma Bums, Kerouac mentions that he wonders where all a rose would travel if you dropped it in the Hudson. So he's kind of recognizing the potential power, the ripples, if you will, that his writing could create by getting attention in New York. There's an irony to that, though. We were talking about why do we see this guy when we think about Kerouac. On the Road finally picked up. He had already written a couple novels. He was getting discouraged and, was probably contemplating giving the whole thing up when On the Road took off. Very soon after he wrote it. Do you think that improved his ability to write? It did the opposite, unfortunately. In a way, it sort of limited his ability to, once he became so famous, he couldn't just put a backpack on his back and hitchhike to San Francisco, wouldn't really work out for him. So, he practically became a hermit. And he also, unfortunately, became an alcoholic. And that's eventually what destroyed his liver. And so you have a very ironic existence, I think, in Kerouac, because, he set forth this real example upon which, it's hard to ignore the fact that most New Age practice in America today actually stems from these few years of Kerouac and Ginsberg and these folks traveling around. And in fact, even today, even within I always got a kick out of this. I taught literature a little bit at college level for a while. And you get these Norton's anthologies, right? They can be a bit snobbish towards certain writing movements. So like the beats don't get covered, right? Maybe it's too soon to be beatified, right? They're canonized. But there's a little irony because Dharma Bums is actually dedicated to Han Shan, Chinese Buddhist poet. Gary Snyder, who ends up being the character J.F. Ryder, not a very far move from Gary Snyder, did translations of Han Shan's poetry that are so powerful that despite Norton's kind of, nose turning toward the beats, they have to use Gary Snyder's translations of Han Shan. So that gets a little snicker out of me every time. But there is something telling in Dharma Bums that lets you know that on some level Kerouac understood some of his failings, some of his shortcomings, because the sort of peak of the book, if you will, the climax, he and his friends who are on this quest, they've gone into the wilderness, so to speak, and are trying to connect with this spiritual realm. And they climb Mount Shasta in California, and Kerouac doesn't make it to the top. He's like 10 feet from the top. And it's just that last few feet is so daunting he can't make it. And so he even says, it's paraphrasing, but he basically says that he's like the Buddha of almost making it. You know? And that sort of describes Kerouac in a nutshell. You know? But I do find that really interesting. I want to mention quickly, he also wrote a poetry collection that gets very little attention. You know, they sort of got pigeonholed quickly. Ginsberg was the poet. Burroughs was the genius novelist. And Kerouac was kind of in this weird no man's land where he wrote this, actually not that long book, right? Novella almost, you could call it, on the road. But I think that's unfair because I think he was sort of the jack of all trades. He wrote Mexico City Blues. You wouldn't think it on the surface, but that's also very significant to his Buddhist practice. That was part of his travels when he went to Mexico City. Wrote these 242 poems, and that's a very significant number within Buddhism because of the Four Noble Truths and Eightfold Path. Mathematically, that creates both the four and the eight for them. So he was very intentional, as I said. A lot of people do just, in fact, Truman Capote infamously called him a typist rather than a writer, right? Ultimate snub. But I think that's utterly untrue. I think he was really a meticulous thinker and writer. And a lot of people say that played into his alcohol dependency as well. That his mind was just always going, and especially about this, focusing so deeply upon the suffering of life, probably did some psychological harm to him. I think that's about all I've got. Yeah, that's good enough. Do you have any questions?
That would be discussion
Garrett?
time.
Yeah, one of
I
the
have to do this like, mutually.
whenever I look at, I guess the proper word would be syncretic mixtures of Buddhism and Christianity. One of the things that I always find difficult to reconcile is this idea of the lack of self and getting rid of the self versus the idea of the human soul, which is the permanence of the self. How did he have issues with that, or how was he able to reconcile that?
And that's the really maybe oversimplified Western view of those two sort of paradigms. Do you know what I mean? Because generally within Asian dichotomies, what you actually have is not, it's more an impermanence of state than an absolute impermanence. In fact, most Eastern practices believe that we eventually enter moksha or nirvana, which is a release from samsara or suffering, the suffering of life, dharma, a release from all that worry, right? But what you're doing is you're rejoining with the one. It's a monistic sort of practice, right? Most of their religions think in that manner. So when you think about reincarnation Buddhistically, it's not that different really from Christian rebirth. It really just comes down a lot of times to semantics and our sort of cultural comfort zones, right? But I actually think that there's an argument that that both would believe in a continuing soul, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Christians don't believe in rebirth. They believe in just